Hello everyone and welcome to Spare a Thought, the podcast that shines a light on the people, ideas, issues and organisations that are often overlooked or misrepresented in the media. I'm your host, Tom Spare. Today you'll hear my extended conversation with Professor Les Back, until recently the head of Sociology at the University of Glasgow. Before that, Les was the director of the Centre for Urban and Community Research at Goldsmiths, University of London. He started out his journey into sociology as a youth worker in London in the 1980s, where young people were creating a new kind of culture of expression in language, music and identity in the face of discrimination, racism and hatred. That experience really shaped his intellectual and political commitments, which became the foundational learning of all his subsequent academic work. The focus of our discussion is the 1979 BBC programme Open Door for an episode It Ain't Half Racist Mum, where academic Stuart Hall and actress Maggie Steed examine bias on television against Black and Asian communities. When the programme was made, the far right were on the march, winning by-elections and shaping the public debate on immigration. Through the conversation in today's episode, you'll see many parallels with today's discourse in the public sphere, media and politics about immigrants, migration and racism. We cover Les's experience of working in academia and youth work, the life and legacy of Professor Stuart Hall, one of the founders of cultural studies, the programme Open Door, and the half-an-hour programme Hall and Steed presented, It Ain't Half Racist Mum, and the lessons that we can draw today. So, let's get into it and explore the programme It Ain't Half Racist Mum.
Hello, my name's Les Back. I teach sociology at the University of Glasgow, but I suppose my formation was in the early 1980s, and I've written a lot about both racism in the media and in popular culture, but also I've written a lot about the role of the media, I suppose, and how to understand it.
So with the first question, it'd be interesting to learn, before we talk about Stuart's work and our topic today, about you and your background. I understand you didn't start in academia. There was a sort of story before that. It'd be great to hear about that and how you went from that to academia, how that influenced your work.
I had a bit of a circuitous route into education. So I was born and grew up in South London. And I suppose that my own family story and my friendship groups really were closely tied to the transformation that was going on in London and other cities in the 70s and early 1980s. So, I remember vividly at school, the National Front leafleting outside my school. There was a very famous National Front march against, quotes, muggers in 1977. And, I had friends and family members who were in the National Front who were on that march. At the same time, I, through playing sport and connections within music and popular culture, had lots of close Black friends who were on the other side of that political contestation that was going on around the streets of who belonged in London. And so that was really my early formation. And I ended up going to university, was the first in my family to go. This is true, but embarrassing. The reason why I wanted to go to university, because I was on the cusp of playing basketball for England, and it was my dream to play professional basketball. And my dad said to me, well, if you want to stay on at school, you're going to have to work. And the only way I could pursue my sporting dream, my hoop dreams, if you like, was that way. So I ended up falling into education. And in the end, that became my passion, And so I moved to New Cross as a student in 1981, just a few months after the New Cross fire, and where these 13 young Black kids who were almost exactly my own age were killed, and a 14th died 2 years later. That was my formation. And it's right at the moment when there is a kind of high water mark of racism in the media. At the same time, the streets of southeast London were the stage for a kind of renaissance of Black life and Black creativity and art. So that's where all of my passions were formed in that particular moment.
And so did you, once you once you went to university, did you go into academia straight after that?
No, I didn't. Of course, this is like I graduated in 1984. In the turmoil of so many political struggles, but the miners' strike was unfolding at that point. There had been the terrible tragedy and murderous tragedy in New Cross. It was around that time that there were other high-profile anti-racist struggles in East London and in West London. It was also just before that moment there had been the famous strike in Grunwick. So I left and didn't know what the hell I was going to do, but then stumbled into youth work. I was good at sport. I loved music. I ended up being a youth worker and made a living by doing small part-time jobs. And in the end, my largest sort of employment was a sessional youth worker in 2 youth clubs. What was happening in those spaces I thought was extraordinary. It wasn't really being attended to. And through doing there was a period when I couldn't decide whether I was going to be a community worker or whether I wanted to try and write about this world. And my supervisor, a wonderful woman called Pat Kaplan, said, you ever thought about doing a PhD, Les? I stayed in contact because I was living locally. And I said, well, I don't know. What's that? And so I started a PhD not knowing whether I'd ever finish it. And it took me a long time to figure out whether I was, but it was really, so for a while in that period, which is really the period that our conversation is set in, the late 1970s, early 1980s, I was in these 2 worlds, really. The world of community work, of community politics, of anti-racist politics, and as well as black politics too, and the university, which still, even in South London at Goldsmiths, was a white island in a very post-colonial sea.
Obviously, all of that atmosphere is rife for, intrigue, and for it's an education in itself, the times that you're living in, right? And I think we're obviously living, and we'll talk about this later, we're living through very fraught times. I guess when you look at the context, it's fraught in different ways, and but it's feeling more and more political, and more people seem to be awakening to that idea of that, actually I need to do something here, otherwise my rights will be taken away, or I'll be ignored by the state, or, there's all these different actors involved. And I suppose your education in multiple senses of where you grew up, but then also where, your academic experience grounded in that real life, in that reality of community. Do you think that stayed with you? That's a social justice.
Absolutely, no question about it. It was oscillating across, and so the people whose ideas seemed so vital were the ones who could in a way take something that seemed mundane and uninteresting and enchant it, suffuse it with a bigger story about not only the place, but of the wider society and the relationship of that place to the world. And so that's exactly how it was for me. And, I often say to people now, your education isn't just when you walk through into the classroom, or that you're sitting down writing your essays. There is an education to be found at the record shop, at the dance, on the street corner, at the bus stop. If you're open to that and you have an attentiveness and a capacity to open yourself, and, these kind of questions over what kind of society was Britain going to be, what kind of city was London going to be, they were unfolding in every corner of the city, every day. And paying attention to that was a curriculum in of itself. And, it was in everyday life, and it was also unfolding within the quite restricted media channels that existed then, which is mainly on television and radio, compared to what we have now in our kind of media saturated landscape of digital communication and the speed of those circulations. So, this question about what kind of society was Britain going to be? What kind of city would London be? And other cities around the UK. That was unfolding every day, if you were paying attention. And I suppose that's the thing that has been a guide. It's been a touchstone for me in times of things that I felt compelled to write about or want to try and understand. So, Stuart Hall, who, I learned about first in that moment. He wrote a book about youth culture with a bunch of other postgraduate students called Resistance Through Rituals, which I remember reading. And she was telling the whole story of British society through style, through music. And Stuart had this wonderful, he was not born in the UK. He wasn't of England or London, but he was the best student of Englishness and British culture, I think, of his generation. And he would say, take the cup of tea, the quintessential icon of Englishness. Where does the tea come from? Where does the sugar come from? It doesn't come from Croydon or Essex. So in that thing, and I met Stuart and had a conversation with him that was recorded many, many years later. And we sat and talked for hours and hours and hours over cereal pots of tea with a woolen tea cozy. He could tell the story of empire through the cup of tea, the plantation societies of the Caribbean, as well as the plantations of the Indian subcontinent. That small material object of small pleasure was linked to this larger historical story of the relationship between Britain and the world.
And I think that story gets muddled up, as you say now, because there's so many, they call it the attention economy, right? So it's like, who's going to buy your time? How are you going to use your time is such a big sort of part of that. And I guess programming on the BBC and, on radio, TV radio, was a really essential way of people learning at that time. Probably, I think it's still, the stat is something like 73% of all adults in the UK have some interaction with the BBC every week. So it's still a big part of our lives, but it was definitely more part of our lives, right, in that period. And obviously the BBC had a big part to play, and it had a big responsibility of how people had got information. And I guess that sort of follows on to the next question about the focus of our conversation, which is the 1979 broadcast of Open Door, It Ain't Half Racist, Mum. For listeners who are unfamiliar, could you provide a quick sort of primer on the two elements involved? You mentioned Stuart, if you could sort of talk about who he was, and then also the programme as well.
Stuart Hall was an extraordinary, it was an intellectual giant, actually, but also a wonderful, funny, irreverent maverick too. So Stuart, born and raised in the Caribbean in Jamaica, came in the 1950s, I think, to Merton College, Oxford, as a Rhodes Scholar. He was going to write a PhD about Henry James. He never finished it. He loved Henry James. He really admired Henry James. And, when he died in 2014, after getting to know him, I took a copy of a Henry James novel to his grave. Not I thought that Stuart for a moment countenanced the idea that he would be reading from the afterlife, but there was just something about that. So he has this incredibly elite, high-table Englishness experience, but at that time too was commuting and living in London, teaching in a secondary modern school in Kennington with these working-class kids, some of whom were Caribbean, first generation Black Londoners. Well, maybe not first generation, but the children of the Windrush generation, migrants from the Caribbean. And so Stuart has this kind of feel and interest in working class life. He's formed by his studies of Marx and of left philosophers and Marxist philosophers. He also becomes involved in this periodical, which was initially called Universities and New Left Review. So he becomes a kind of figure of left-wing intellectual life. He famously corresponds with the American sociologist C. Wright Mills, who comes and gives lectures in London. So he's this young kid, really, in this world of intellectual giants like E.P. Thompson and figures of that sort of stature. But then Stuart is asked by Richard Hogger, who wrote this very important book, one of the books that, in a way, explained a lot of my own life to myself, called The Uses of Literacy. He published that book, Richard Hogger, in 1957, which was really about the popular arts, the new media landscape of consumerism, and what that meant for working class communities, particularly the one that he was born into in Hunslet in Leeds. So Hogger invites Stuart Hall to direct with him the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham. And it is there that Hoggart and Hall create a sort of template for what we understand today as a kind of critical media studies and critical studies of popular culture, and to take popular culture as seriously as we would take so-called high culture, and to treat it with the analytical precision and analysis that you would apply to the highest forms of cultural expression. Stuart occupies this extraordinary place, I think. He is a Caribbean intellectual who left the Caribbean and never went back, is completely at home in English and British culture, particularly in London, but he's not part of it. He's both at home here and not at home here. An incredible interpreter. He knows the culture like the back of his hand, as he once put it, but has the perspective of somebody who comes to it without some of the mythologies and condescensions, if you like, of dominant understandings.
And I suppose his story tells a story of not only of his generation of migrants that came from the Caribbean, from the West Indies, but also I suppose it's probably a story and an experience that a lot of people that come here as migrants, as immigrants, would also identify with too, right? It's that sort of insider, outsider, somewhere in between world that you would live in if you're an immigrant, but also if you're from mixed heritage too, right? So yeah. There's sort of so many elements there that I think a lot of people would probably identify with.
I think that's right, Tom. And the thing that and these are but for your listeners who can probably tell already, my heritage is a usual mongrel Londoner, but I'm a white Londoner. And growing up alongside friends and neighbours who are carrying this history in them. They're carrying these dispositions in them. And one of the things that struck me so powerfully, and just being attentive and trying to be open in a time when there was tremendous foreclosing, tremendous shutting down, shutting out of attention to anyone who didn't look exactly like you. The thing that, abiding memories is that very often those people like Stuart, but also many others, I think of my friends' parents, who knew so much about the culture of England, knew more about the culture of England than my parents did, but were, an ocean away from it. And in the colonial context, they were taught, the history of these islands. They knew them intimately. And yet at the same time, the great double standard of racism was that their white counterparts, those citizens, remember, these are not immigrants. These are citizens of the British Empire. They become immigrants in that moment of racialization that happens in the mid-20th century. But the attention to those citizens living outside of the British Isles isn't matched by white Britons at all. They're completely ignorant about those experiences of colonial citizens and their relationship between these islands and the hinterlands of empire. So, there's such a kind of double standard in that.
And could you talk a little bit about what Open Door was as a program?
The story of Open Door is really about it was called the Community Programming Unit, or Community Program Unit, CPU, and it was set up actually by David Attenborough, who we think of as the great naturalist, but David Attenborough had also ideas about how the BBC and the mass media could have democratic potential too. I think he believed in that. I think there's something in the texture of his broadcasting as well that conveys that. And so the idea that there would be community, that basically citizens would be observers of their own lives. They would be documenters of their own lives. They would be the authors of the programs that other citizens would watch. So it's, you can see the sort of antecedents, if you like, of what, YouTube and digital culture would become, but through the channels of the BBC. And Open Door was part of the community programming enterprise, and I think it was set up in the early 1970s, so 1972. By the time that Ain't Half Racist Mum is made by Stuart and Maggie Steed, who we'll come on to, I'm sure, it had already been established. So there'd been a whole strand of programs effectively made within communities by interest groups and their whole variety of programs. They weren't all about issues of racism and immigration and those kinds of questions. They're an incredible mixed bag, actually. There's programs about animal rights and animal liberation politics. There's programs about sexual politics and feminism and queer rights. And so it becomes this open door to a wider constituency of citizens and what they care about.
I mean, it's mentioned actually in the documentary about outside of the BBC voice, this sort of weird, otherworldly, but also familiar voice that you would hear, this is the BBC and a voice of authority. So it's sort of, that open door policy, I guess, is that you bring in other perspectives and different voices and people from different places.
So I think it's important not to just take or to think more subtly about how uneven the BBC as an institution is in this moment. So on the one hand, it's undoubted in terms of the way in which the coverage works, way in which the news is constituted, if you like, brought together, how it's enacted, that the interests of the wider dominant society are very clear. Lord Reith himself, he makes a cameo in Ain't Half Racist saying, well, shouldn't we be being reasonable about the dominant interests of the culture, So on the one hand, the BBC is the medium of the establishment. At the same time, the BBC is trying to be a public broadcaster in the service of the public. So there's this kind of tension that's unfolding inside the BBC, and it's by no means in any doubt that it was the dominant interests of the wider society that were in charge and were calling the shots. And things like Open Door were the exceptions to the rule, if you like, to the rule of domination, really. In terms of how the management of the news and of current affairs worked and whose interests it served. But, there is that sense that figures like David Attenborough were trying to harness the democratic potential of the media.
Obviously the whole conversation is based around this episode, It Ain't Half Racist Mum. And as you say, it's presented really quite in a fascinating, quite a stark way. You've got Stuart Hall and Maggie Steed. Do you want to say anything about Maggie Steed?
Yeah,
it's quite
I
an
do.
unusual pairing between the two.
I could talk about Maggie Steed for forever because I think she is one of the anti-racist heroines of the media, And so, So you've got Stuart Hall, who by this point he's in his mid to late 40s. He's established himself as a kind of intellectual powerhouse, really. He is a public figure. He's often being on television. He's also, breaking new ground in the analysis and writing about popular culture, and also understanding the crisis that Britain was in the midst of, in 1979, he also publishes a book. I think it's 79. I might have to check this, but I think it is 79. He publishes a very important book called Policing the Crisis, with a whole series of his students at the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham. And it really is a diagnosis of the crisis itself and how the crisis is being managed, as Britain moves from being, a social democratic, industrial-based society and the post-war settlement around welfarism into another moment or another conjuncture, as he would say, another alignment of political, economic and social forces. So there's this crisis moment of change that Stuart Hall's trying to understand. He is the prime interpreter of that moment. History has decided that in a way, or at least in my mind, that's true. So there's Stuart on the one hand, so this intellectual heavyweight. And then there's Maggie Steed, who at the time was a young actress who was left of centre politically in terms of her political convictions. I think she was working in a socialist theatre group, and she was offered this job not as a kind of as a film star and a star actress that she became, but she's being invited into this space to be a kind of co-presenter. Because what's so interesting about the program is it kind of imitates, almost parodies, the forms that the staging of BBC impartiality usually operated within. So there are two people, both sitting behind desks, both speaking straight to camera, both sort of creating little soliloquies and synopsis and links to clips from various things. So they're very self-consciously parodying the professed neutrality of the BBC, which is no form of neutrality at all, actually. So it's very subtle and clever in its form. But the thing about Maggie Steed that I want to say, because I do think she's an extraordinary woman. She's still alive, and I hope we'll talk about this. But the figure and place and the role of white anti-racist voices. She's such an interesting case. So on the one hand, in this program, she is the white female co-presenter. But in other important films and programs that were made at the time, and I'm thinking particularly of Franco Rossi's film Babylon, Maggie played racist characters, and she played them with such searing believability and conviction. I mean, it's a very brave thing to do, to take on the persona of popular racism and the voice of it in that time faithfully and believably and powerfully. And so I think she occupies a very honourable place in this history, actually, as a kind of white anti-racist figure, both as an activist but also as an actor.
Mm. Yeah, and I suppose it's that. I mean, the demonstration, or like what people forget about acting is that it is pretend, but it is. I always get annoyed when people say, "Well, are you anything like your character?" And it's such a weird question because it's like, well, no, they're acting. They're really good at it, Which
I mean, for those who are listening, please, you can watch Aint Half Racism on the BBC iPlayer, but go and watch Babylon. It's an extraordinary film, and it's exactly that point you make, Tom. What Maggie Steed does so incredibly is she brings the voice and the personification of that kind of the nature of the problem to the screen, not in a way to try and condone it or understand it or give it space in our language today, but to see it and hear it for what it is. I mean, it's incredible, that performance that she gives in Babylon. And in a way, what she's doing in Ain't Half Racist Mum is something quite different. She's, I think, she's commented later that when she first started, she was a young actress. You know, she was being told what to do. Really, she's been directed, and I think she was a bit too smiley and a bit too presenterly. And so in the film, as we watch it now, she's kind of angry and edgy and surly, and it gives a real edge to the analysis, actually. But yeah, extraordinary, Will Richer for the existence of Maggie Steed on screen, I think.
And I suppose so. The program itself focuses on the representation of Black and Asian. Actually, it's good you made the point that the Windrush generation were citizens of empire. So I suppose it is that by this point the program is talking about both migrants and immigrants, and looking at the representation of Black and Asian migrants and immigrants on British television. What are the core findings about how these communities were being portrayed, and what did it say about the underlying racial assumptions of the era?
Well, that's a very big question, Tom, and I'll do my best. But, you know, I think just to start where you, at the beginning of your question, language matters. Words matter. Words are the purveyors, they're the carriers of meaning and power. Those citizen migrants came on the Empire Windrush and other boats as willing hands. You know, George Orwell once commented, you know, Orwell was a contentious figure, but another one of my heroes, really. He said, you know, the thing about the British working class is that most of the British working class doesn't live in Britain. It lives in India and the Caribbean and other parts of the empire. They were citizens of the British Empire. But in this moment, in the mid-20th century, those citizens, when they get off the boat at Tilbury or wherever it is, or come out of the station at Waterloo, they become immigrants. Just like that. Through the switch of lexicon, the power of those words. And they can be, and becoming an immigrant means you are not from here. Your belonging here is questionable. How many of you are there? How long are you going to stay? How many of you will you become as you have children and your families grow? So, you know, and one of the important points that the program makes from the very, very outset is to debunk and undermine the neutrality of language, particularly the neutrality of the BBC's language. But all language assembles the world rather than simply reflects it. So the choice of those words are important, and that's why Stuart Hall as a figure is so important. How are those choices of words invested, or what Stuart would say, encoded with meaning? And then how are those encoded meanings decoded by viewers? So the program, you know, it moves between really very different registers. It's not really about Black life at all, or the life of what we've come to replace words like immigrant with other terms which are less invested in outsiderness, but of diasporic communities, of communities that are connected across space and time. It doesn't really deal with that at all. What it deals with really is the way in which the so-called race problem is constituted in the media, and the ways in which racism operates, often in a way that doesn't announce itself, but is enacted through the choice of words, the choice of metaphors, and the choice of people who speak, if that makes sense. So it's really about how the program is trying to deconstruct the impartiality that the BBC claims in such prized ways, and then reveal the tropes which are being used to portray and stereotype Black and brown Britons. And, you know, and the way that works, it works both in terms of humor. There were some very famous, popular comedies of the time. And the film, Stuart and Maggie Steed's film, takes its title for a play on a popular comedy called It Ain't Half Hot Mum, which was a colonial drama of a concert party during World War II somewhere in the British Raj. And, there are lots of figures, some of whom are South Asian actors playing racist caricatures, and some of them are white actors who are in brownface, who are being blacked up, And so that legacy, if you like, of minstrelsy is also playing out here. And the Sergeant Major, Windsor Davis, in his very sort of extraordinary Welsh accent, is overseeing this world in sometimes abusive and harsh ways, calling people names and racist language. And, the power of those films, those programs, really, it wasn't just it didn't happen on television only. It seeped out into the popular consciousness, into everyday life. I remember that racist language being used in the playground against friends of colour, regardless of where they were from. References to punkawallahs and things of that nature, and demands being barked at people. So one of the things that the program does is to take humor seriously, and why the jokes matter, what the jokes do, how the jokes construct stereotypes about otherness and race. So there's that part of and then how the BBC defend them as well, which is another part of it. But then there is a very clear deconstruction of the documentary form, how documentaries are assembled. And one of the things which I think the program communicates so powerfully, both visually and in its argument, is that while the voices of the white concerned citizens about the immigrants are definitely present, but there are very, very few voices of colour. There are very few voices of the people who are being spoken of. And I think that's so telling, So it's a discussion about the race problem where black folk appear, they don't speak. And I think Stuart Hall was such an important figure in that he was a giant of letters and intellectual life, a colonial citizen himself, an emerging Black Britain. He deconstructing this process. But the thing that, Stuart had a tremendous affinity to the experience, particularly of working class life in Britain. I think he had such a strong affinity and interest in the histories, if you like, particularly of the English working class, but not exclusively. But what he's also very, very critical are the way in which white experts are wheeled out as the ones who can be impartial. They're always white academic voices. They always seem to be the impartial authority that in a way is like the kind of ombudsman, the person who is weighing the evidence and deciding where the balance of truth is. And that in itself is part of the problem. And that's not to say that Stuart Hall or any of those figures thought that there was no place for white intellectual voices or political voices in this struggle. The fact that Maggie Steed is co-presenting with him is evidence of that in of itself. But it's the way in which the stagings of white authority work he was so attentive to. And the critique is so sharp and so right. And then there's another part of the program that deals with public debates and the public conversation. So I think those are the three main strands. But what the program is trying to do is to try and understand how the issue of race and racism is being assembled within this media. So it's not being reflected. And the question of how truth is made is the thing which I think underlies all of the segments in the program. And it's questioning the impartiality of the BBC as the purveyors of truth, and also the complicity of those program makers in the culture of racism itself.
It's this interesting thing. I mean, there's a bit in the program where there are, I don't know if it's a conference or, there's that questioning of like executives, right?
Yeah,
and I said, well, it's fine. It's not doing any harm.
Yeah,
That's basically
absolutely.
like the assessment that's sort of made. Yeah, it's not doing anyone any harm, but obviously it is.
Yes, that part of the program you're talking about is a kind of this isn't just an artifact of the past. There are media circuses regularly and routinely, as you know all too well. So the program then has this fabulous sort of news reportage of a TV conference in Edinburgh, and Michael Grade is there being tested about one of the programs that was very popular at the time, which I remember watching as a kid, and laughing at and being confused by, because it's called Mind Your Language. It was about people learning to speak English. So the teacher is white. The classroom is full of in a way, the children of empire. But all of those, and some of the people who are portraying, the Sikh student or the Caribbean student from Jamaica, or whoever it is, they are part of that history themselves. But they're playing these caricatures, these comic caricatures. Somebody challenges the program makers to, defend this. Aren't you just peddling stereotypes? You're legitimizing through humor all of these stereotypes about, in people of Indian heritage who are cheating the welfare system. They're, people of South Asian heritage who are living, 3 families in one room. All these sorts of stereotypes of black life, and it's making them into a big joke. And Harvey Barkley, who was the head of comedy at the time, is in that meeting, and he's been held to account. And he's incredibly pompous, posh English bloke, and he's trying to defend this as somehow assimilating difference and representing the diversity of British society in this emergent multicultural moment in the classroom. Well, what is being celebrated here? Well, what's being celebrated are a gallery of stereotypes, often very pernicious ones, which represent black and brown Britons as indigent, malingerers, cheating the system, and sometimes curiously doubled. So, the South Asian characters are sometimes represented as working too hard, as working 4 jobs, and not being able to do their homework for the language class. So this kind of gallery of racist stereotypes are being brought to life in the classroom. But Harvey Barkley defends it. He defends it. I mean, it seems laughable now, and perhaps it was laughable then, given it is a comedy, that he would defend it in that way. But he does nonetheless. He creates it. He defends it in what Stuart Hall would call many, many years later as a form of multicultural drift. This is just the fact of how life is. Well, it isn't the fact. It wasn't the fact of how life is. It was the staging of these very pernicious racist stereotypes.
The programme made some stark observations about the BBC's approach in particular. And we hear Hall say, in the name of balance, the stronger racism becomes, the more airtime it gets.
Yeah.
And this echoes the idea of a sort of strategic bias and a sort of both-sidism in contemporary journalism, which journalist and broadcaster Emily Maidsless talked about in her 2022 James Haggart lecture, which when I was doing my MA, we watched that lecture. So how did the BBC justify giving a platform to extreme views, such as, for example, that there's I think the leader of the National Party, an ultra-right party, and he's just walking along a meeting, talking to people in a locked room.
Yeah, Stuart calls him the John Wayne of racism. Fantastic. That's exactly what it. So these figures, and this is why the film has lasted, because actually, and sadly, tragically, the relevance of it is still absolutely present and current. So these figures, these hateful figures, I mean, it's kind of shocking to know how many of them, they're notorious figures in the history of racism now, but they're right there on national TV, on TV. So yeah, his name was Kingsley Reid, and I think he was in the National Front as well. But he's presented as this kind of purveyor of the common truth of the natives, of the whites, but makes all these extraordinary claims about the sanitation, the poor levels of sanitation, of people defecating in the street, all these kinds of claims about what's going on within minority communities, and they're just treated as facts, the truth, and it makes me think about the sorts of worries and qualms there are now in our moment about those voices. The racist imagination has always been obsessed with empirical issues, empirical facts, numbers, stories, the plain truth, the truth that no one else will listen to. It's the same pattern that we're experiencing now. But in this case, these figures are presented like these kind of tribunes from the ordinary Britons, from the white communities who are being impinged on. There's another point that the film makes, is that many of those documentaries, the problem that they're focusing on is the problem that these black and brown communities aren't staying in their places, that they're moving outside. They're seeking mobility, they're seeking better homes, they're seeking to move. And this is the problem that troubles them, the incursion into white space. And it's very stark to watch. You think, God, yeah, it's so, in a way, it's so crude, the way these things are represented. So yeah, I mean, it means that those figures have a privileged place. And there's a few wonderful moments when, Stuart or Maggie Steed says, well, and I think actually Kingsley Reid is credited with a significant political achievement, and the presenters kind of playing with the BBC style of presenting, say, yeah, and could you imagine, that Fidel Castro would be presented to the British viewers as having significant lessons for them, or the Black Panther Party for that matter. And the double standard is very, very clear and stark, all in the name of balance. Well, balance here, and I think in our time too, very often means giving space and conferring authority to hateful voices.
And probably one of the best representations, or the worst representations, is Enoch Powell, who is mentioned in the programme. For those who don't know of Enoch Powell, could you sort of give a bit of a overview of who he was?
Enoch Powell, it's interesting, that in the times that I interviewed Stuart Hall, long after this program was aired, Stuart was fascinated by Powell because, Powell, a figure of the conservative right, who's in a way splits off from the culture of the Tory party and the Tory party line. He is, in a way, the kind of he's the prototype of what we come to call populism now, right-wing populism. So he splits off. He becomes this, he's cultivating this sense of being a charismatic leader, speaking the unspeakable truth about immigration. He gives a very, very famous speech in Birmingham in 1968, in the Bullring, in a hotel there, claiming the so-called rivers of blood speech that immigration would lead to these, like the Roman metaphor of a river foaming with blood from the bloodbath that immigration will wreak on British society. And so Powell himself becomes the voice, or the symbol, if you like, of these forms of anti-immigration rhetoric and racism. He becomes its champion, and the strange thing about him, though, is and Stuart said this to me, he loved India, Powell. He worshipped India. He thought India was an extraordinary civilization, but Indians should be in India, and they should stay there, and they could be conveyed with tremendous value in India, but not in Handsworth. not in the Bullring, not in Smethwick, not in the Midlands. So very complicated, because racism is a complicated beast. It's a complicated form of power, and its complications are important to really wrestle with and think about. So yeah, and Powell, what's interesting in the program is that in that third sort of theme in the program, there's lots of footage of public debates, and footage of key people like Robin Day, who became Sir Robin Day, who was like the arbiter of the public debate, like the sort of chairperson of Question Time and the like. And Robin Day is chairing a debate around so-called immigration. Powell is in the room. Powell is constantly being deferred to as an authority. Powell's claims are constantly being cited, and the program points this out. So much so, actually, that 3 months after the broadcast of the program, the BBC issued another apology about the program because it wanted to distance itself from impugning the impartiality of Sir Robin Day. He wasn't quite a Sir then, but all these uncomfortable patterns of the way in which racism is both allowed to be expressed and then glossed were being revealed in the program.
This is a really weird parallel or comparison. It really reminded me of in the 2010 general election, and you had the leadership debates, and he said, I agree with Nick. There was this whole thing of anything Nick Clegg was saying, Gordon Brown would say the same. And it really felt a bit like that, is that we are conferring this authority to you. And a member of the audience speaks up in that clip too and says, well, what about the other side? What about the other side of the argument? And he gets shut down. He can't say anything.
Exactly.
And what Hall says in the episode is that the debate starts from like Enoch Powell's racist chain of reasoning, which is immigrants equals blacks equals too many of them equals send them back.
Totally.
And can you explain how this framing's allowed the media to cover issues like crime and unemployment?
It goes back to the point that I was alluding to earlier. The empirical obsession with or the racist imagination's obsession with the empirical, with evidence, with numbers. Now, not for a moment am I saying that the facts don't matter or that the numbers don't matter, but it is so true, that figures get so easily transposed into lives and experiences, or that they become the ciphers for. So I think what Stuart is talking about, and this kind of pattern is very much alive in our time, the so-called migrant crisis. How much is it about numbers? And what Stuart points out is that, on the one hand, there are those presences, those people that are racialized. They are blacks in the language of the time. Blacks and immigration, or race and immigrant, those two things are tied. They become tied. So we're not talking about Australians or Canadians. No, we're talking about people of color. So race and the figure of the immigrant and race get tied together. Paul Gilroy once put it very well, that tying holds our imagination hostage, the tying of those two things. And then the question is, well, how many? The answer is too many. The response is send them back. And this kind of logic is so alive in our time. It's both an echo of that power-like moment, but also an echo of this historical moment too. Stuart Hall once commented that, the problem with the difficulty of our time is that our culture, and particularly in England, that culture lives off a reservoir of unconscious feelings about race. Mm-hmm. That reservoir of unconscious feelings spills out in the way in which these issues are reported, spills out in the phobias and panic about numbers and about this kind of question of, it is a kind of power-like phobia of how the culture is changing and what it will be.
Yeah, I mean, I just immediately thought about "stop the boats," and the whole phrasing around that, and so I suppose in that sense, you talked about a lot of the alluding to today and the parallels. When we think about the modern media landscape, which is very different to the one in 1979, and also politically too. Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979. That was a real changing moment. What do you think, if Stuart were alive today, what would he make of the contemporary media landscape? And how's the critique concerning false balance translated to algorithms and so forth?
Well, I think he would be interested in, I can't speak for him, although I listen to him a lot. But my gut feeling would be he would be very much alive to those historical resonances, if you like, the water that's in that reservoir of unconscious feelings about race that still, I think, guide the culture. But he would be very attentive to how that's changing, because racism isn't a static form of power. It's a scavenger ideology. It moves, it changes form. It retains some characteristics and finds other ways to express itself. But I think that the lesson or the thing that Stuart Hall gives us is a repertoire of tools to try and make sense of the continuities and the changes. And it's important for your listeners to know as well that Stuart Hall, in a way, anticipated the line of travel that leads to our political reality now. He was the first person to coin the phrase Thatcherism. He understood that 1979-80 moment was a historic break, a shift, a move into a different conjuncture, as he would say, a conjuncture where authoritarianism and populism were being tied. In a way, the emergence of Margaret Thatcher took the wind out of the sails of people like Kingsley Reid. And who else was I was really shocked to see Martin Webster on national television, David Duke, the high-ranking figure in the Ku Klux Klan. They're on national TV. It's extraordinary, really. So he understood the line of travel. In a way, Thatcher stole that energy and channeled it into her brand of conservatism. But actually, once that is harnessed and channeled politically, it might take different forms, but it's at the center of the polity, it feels like to me. So Stuart anticipated that. I think he would be very interested in the ways in which there are also shifts and splits going on. He would want us to pay very close attention to the metaphors that are being used. Racism as a discourse of power is completely obsessed with liquid metaphors, swamping, floods. So no surprise then that the image of the boat becomes another invested metaphor, which is about the unwanted presence of the stranger on this shore. He would want us to be very, very attentive to that and what that does to the way in which we think about the mobility of humankind. We live in a world that is both more connected than any other time and also more divided, perhaps, than at any other time. And the interplay of those two things are very strong in the culture, it feels like. And and even when we try and visualize the movement of people, they very often look like wars of invasion, don't they? These vectors of migration look like forms of invasion. And I think that it's a poverty of our imagination to find other ways to imagine the mobility and the interconnectedness of the human family. So I think that the great lesson that Stuart bestowed on us is to pay attention to not just the facts, but how the facts are constituted, how they're presented, how and they're manufactured not in a way that necessarily you need to get beyond the idea of it being true or false, but think about how that process of making works and what its effects are.
And as well, you made me think about that again, about Stop the Boats, and the Prime Minister that was talking about it being Rishi Sunak, born in 1980 to immigrants, first Hindu Prime Minister. So it's that, and it's again this baking in of racism between identities too, which for me is very confusing when I see
yes that. And you know, you have every I'm going to say every right, but you know, it's completely understandable that it's confusing, but it isn't confusing if you really understand the history of empire and how empires were both built and how they reproduced themselves. You know, figures like Frantz Fanon, for example, who, you know, is born in Martinique, writes this very important book about the Algerian Revolution, understood this very well. So, you know, the culture of empire and of racism doesn't exclude absolutely black and white. It can work that way, but very often what it does is creates hierarchies of belonging. It creates, you know, it offers as part of the political deal for presence a place to some at different points on that ladder of belonging, and it can be racialized differently as a consequence of that. You know, so it's, I mean, the fact that the conservative right can assimilate difference and diversity to the point in which it's almost like a kind of diversity form of conservatism is actually part of a much longer historical pattern of the way in which empires are built and reproduce themselves. It assimilates difference and then articulates exclusion. Can't be racist. How can he possibly be racist? Because Rishi Sunak is brown, you know, and I think that it's part of the complexity of our moment, really. And that again, you know, that's the kind of level of analysis or the determinations of analysis, as Stuart Hall would say, that we really need to have to open ourselves to thinking about carefully and understand the mechanisms of these forms of exclusion, you know, which I think, you know, are complicated. They were complicated around the Brexit debate, and they're complicated no less now, you know. So on the one hand, the children of those colonial citizen migrants can sometimes end up being the most vociferous opponents of the new strangers on the beach. Now, that isn't confusing if you understand the way in which these blocks, if you like, of the terms of belonging are being negotiated and are being established and re-established. Racism doesn't exclude, absolutely. It never has. It works through very complex mechanisms of assimilation and exclusion at the same time.
And also, I mean, you know, because racism's toxic, it will burn through any container which is being carried as well. You know, it's sort of in its language and in how it's presented, how people present themselves. And so the last question is the conclusion of the episode itself, and it just says, "Don't trust the media. Don't take them sitting down." I mean, you can't really think of a BBC program today that would just don't trust us, basically.
Well, you know, but what are we interested in at the end of the day? Are we interested in just passively assuming a view of the world, or are we interested in thinking? You know, I think that are we interested in trying to have open discussions, to live with doubt rather than certainty? And, you know, I love that part of the program where it says, well, you know, don't trust what you see on the screen. And the implication is, I mean, they have a very, very strong critique and analysis, and they make that analysis to try and persuade. But there is an implication there too that commitment to openness and critical thinking should be applied to everything and everybody at all times. And, you know, that's a vision of education that I believe in. And so, you know, it's trying to think better and hard and in an open way about the key problems of our time, that's why I think, we need voices and sensibilities like the ones that are unfolding in this, 30-minute program that was done, on a shoestring. We didn't say that the BBC didn't allow, and neither did ITV, any of the news coverage to be included in the program. Speak about balance and two-sidedness. It was censorship there. They basically didn't allow any of that coverage to be aired in this program. And it's the irony, as they say, as Stuart says, it's a program that's part of the Open Door series that actually comes into the back door of the media landscape. And so I think that commitment to doubt in the service of understanding, I think, is very much alive. And that sensibility is a really precious one in our time, because I think we live in a time that suffers not from doubt, but from certainties, from false certainties that often gloss the complex realities of what our culture is and what it's becoming.
They make that statement, and then as they're concluding, as the light's going down, we'll hand over now to the editors. So it's sort of it's that final last little sort of jab.
It's interesting that in a way the program is trying to take down and defuse some of the viciousness in the humour of that time, and it was vicious. It's almost unbelievable now watching it to think that so many of us did take it sitting down. We just sat and watched it. But also, thinking doesn't have to be surly and serious, although sometimes it is gravely so. And thinking with Stuart Hall was always fun. My abiding memory of him is his laugh. His laugh was sometimes joyful, it was sometimes sardonic and cutting and laughing at the play of the powerful. So no surprises there that there's a little twist at the end. We're returning you back to business as usual.
That brings to an end this episode of Spare a Thought. My thanks to Professor Les Back for being such a generous guest, and my thanks to Dr. Nick Beach from the University of Birmingham for introducing Les and I, and for suggesting this programme in particular to be the centre of our discussion. If you would like to find out more about the podcast and hear my thoughts on a range of topics, you can subscribe to my Substack, which I've linked in the notes. You can also find a link to the programme which we discussed today, Open Door, the Ain't Half Racist Mum, which, if you don't have access to iPlayer, is also available on YouTube. I would really appreciate you rate this podcast. The more people that rate, comment and follow, the more people it can reach in the wider world. Spare a Thought is a Be the Change Media Network production. I'm Tom Spare, and this has been Spare a Thought. It ain't half racist, mum. Thanks for listening.